Hello, everyone. I am Melissa Forziat. I'm a keynote speaker and the host of this Halt and Catch Fire Rewatch podcast. Now, when I speak, my topic is something I call Take the Doughnut, which for me is another way to say Carpe Diem. It comes from this strange thing that happened in college where I left an actual donut on a table, but it became an object lesson for me and what it looks like to leave opportunities behind. So now I want to take the donut instead of leave it behind. So something I wanted to take advantage of this year was the idea of rewatching the show Halt and Catch Fire, but this time actually talking about it with other people, which hadn't happened on previous watches of this show for me. So here's how this has worked. First, I started with doing the episode recaps, really deep dives into the episodes. And then I started doing interviews with cast and crew. And now I'm even expanding this universe and starting to talk with people who, in some way, have a connection to the world of Halt and Catch Fire and can maybe present a new angle or a new subject matter to discuss around the show. So, this is intended to be a basically spoiler free conversation as much as we can to tease some people who perhaps haven't heard of the show before, but also to give a little bit of different insight into the show from a different angle for those who have seen it. So if you meet one of those categories, you're in the right place. That should be pretty much everybody, actually. And I'm very excited to introduce my guests for today because we're going to talk about basically pop culture in the world of Halt and Catch Fire. And my guests for today include Danielle Turchiano, who's a former journalist and host of the Made Possible by Pop Culture podcast, as well as Maureen Ryan, contributing editor of Vanity Fair and an entertainment critic. Welcome.
Thank you for having
me. Yeah, I was like that. I'm a little nervous. The intro was like, oh, we're going to provide a new angle. Uh-oh.
Interestingly enough, of the interviews I've been doing, we really have not dealt with pop culture at all. So I was trying to figure out how to sort of like work this in because it feels like the whole thing you do need to discuss about this show. And this ended up being so perfect. Before we get into it, though, I would love to hear from both of you. Like, tell me about your journey with the show Halt and Catch Fire. I'll start with Maureen on that one.
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of what sort of strikes me about the show is that the time that it was on, it was a very transitional era in television. And I think also for a critic, I have to I have to be very honest about like where my brain was at that time. So 10 years ago, where my brain was at was we were kind of transitioning out of the anti-hero era, but our brains had been bombarded every single day with screeners of shows about difficult white men. And, the usual caveat, like some of those shows were great. And specifically though, on AMC, we'd had Breaking Bad, again, great show. Mad Men, we like AMC had really carved out a brand as like that type of drama was their bread and butter. So again, nothing wrong with that niche, but when it first came along, it's really tough sometimes when you as a critic are like, how do I calibrate my response to this, because I'm overexposed to a lot of pilots for Breaking Bad and Sopranos ripoffs that are bad shows. You know what I mean? Like I've been over inundated with this stuff. So I will say that when I first looked at the pilot, I thought, okay, really good cast and some interesting, grace notes about that subculture of technology and just the roots of where we are now in terms of tech culture. It was not that it was uninteresting. It was just like, oh boy, here we go again, And so there were women in the cast, obviously from day one. I do think, the creators of the show talked about this, that they kind of, I do think that the overall, and Danielle can correct me if she's not on this page, but or at her input, but like it felt like a lot of us in terms of TV writers and critics were like wary of Halt and Catch Fire right when it came out, because it was like we had been inundated with this kind of drama, and we were starting to see lots of interesting things, Jane the Virgin and Orange is the New Black, and Atlanta was sort of on the horizon. Like there were all these more inclusive array of shows coming, and we were like, are we doing this? That said, that's a big setup to my journey with this show. I ended up loving the show so much. I just posted, before we began talking, the ATX TV Festival reunion panel with some of the cast and creative team, which was so moving and so beautiful. This was a cast and creative team that cared so much. That was so obvious. And I really, really respect the show for many things. Among them, having a creative team, and not just having a cast that could knock everything out of the park and then some. Production design, everything about it was so interesting and so thoughtfully rendered. But the creative team was like, we are going to alter course as what's most interesting about these relationships and these characters jumps out. And so it evolved so beautifully. And it's really also worth noting these were creators with not a huge track record or no track record in TV. And obviously they had help from different, EPs and producers and stuff. So they were kind of coming in green, and they've also been very open about that. So, but what I love about their attitude was not, well, this is our vision and we're sticking to it. It was very, very, beautifully evolved. And as it evolved, it totally captured my heart and very much ended up on a lot of people's top 10 lists.
What a beautiful way to describe the long journey that you went on with the show, and you came in with a lot of contextual information that I did not come in with, and so I think that probably changed our experiences quite a lot as we were going through. Danielle, what about you? What was your journey with this show?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely don't want to refute anything you said. I do think there were a lot of people that were a little wary. For a number of reasons. I was kind of on my own transitional journey at the time. I was taking my first detour out of journalism. That proved to be kind of short-lived, but so the show Halt and Catch Fire premiered in 2014, and I was still freelancing a little bit, but I had like one foot in something else at the moment. So I didn't get to write about it as much as I would have if it had maybe come on earlier. I mostly was watching it as a fan. I wrote like maybe one or two stories right in the beginning. And then I took a job where I couldn't do any freelance writing. And so then just stayed on that journey as a fan. But for me, what was really important maybe was I suddenly was all in on AMC because of Halt and Catch Fire. I'll be honest, like, yes, Breaking Bad, amazing show. Yes, Mad Men, culturally groundbreaking, etc. They weren't really my shows. Like, I appreciated them for what they were. I actually started to like Breaking Bad more on the second watch after it had ended. But the previous year before Halt and Catch Fire came out, Orphan Black was at TCA, and that's the Television Critics Association. They do like a press tour twice a year where they have networks come and basically like promote their new shows or promote their returning shows that they're really putting money behind. And I remember being in that room and I was like, AMC, like, I don't know if I'm really going to write about much, whatever. That trailer played and I was like, suddenly I care a lot about this network. And so it was like the 1-2 punch. There was Orphan Black and then Halt and Catch Fire came. And for me, I thought I was a techie when I was a kid. I wasn't. I like did not keep up with the changing technology. Now I'm really a Luddite because I don't like all the smart home stuff. But I was really invested in the concept from the beginning. And I might have been a little bit more forgiving than some about the characters because I'll be honest and I'll say like I looked at the time period it was set in and said like, oh yeah, we're gonna have like all white male characters because of the time. And maybe that is an excuse for a network to just put on a show with all white male characters, but it does feel accurate. And so I was willing to go on the journey anyway. And then I was pleasantly surprised and my favorite characters ended up being like the Camerons of the world. So I was pleasantly surprised to see it wasn't just that. But it was I was very taken by the show in ways I didn't expect, partially because I think of the evolution that it allowed for AMC to have. Whether or not AMC is happy with that evolution is not for me to say. But between what it did for the network and then what it also did for me with the surprise of the characters, like I said, like Cameron and Donna, and eventually Diane.
This is so lovely to hear. I'll give a little bit of, as between questions, I'll give a little bit of background on the show to help put things into context. So for some background on the show itself, Halt and Catch Fire is going to tell the story of a team of main characters. I'm going to say 5 main characters who have different technical skill sets, and they're at the forefront of major tech advancements from 1983 to 1994. So if you think about the types of tech advancements we were having around computers at that time. It's basically chronicling that. We're starting with personal computers, community game and chat forums. We even get up towards like the World Wide Web and the development of that. So that's sort of a big picture of it. But as you think about, obviously your journey is, Maureen, it was a slower burn for you. Danielle, you were kind of in from the beginning. What drew you to this show? When you said yes to this interview, what was the thing about this show that made you say, yeah, I do want to talk about that now?
I mean, I'll just say for me, I think those are maybe two different questions. Because what drew me in initially, like I only had what AMC was willing to put out in terms of like the press materials, like to tell me what they thought the show they were selling me was. And so what I remember of why I was interested in it at that time was because of the idea that the characters we were following were outsiders. And I've always I don't know if I would say I'm like an underdog person, but I am very, very anti-establishment, anti-corporation. And so the fact that like hearing, oh, Joe used to work for the big guy and now we're doing something different. I was like, yes, I want to see what that is. Is this a revolution? Like, how closely will this adhere to anything that actually happened? Is maybe a little bit of the interest too, because, their company was fictional, but IBM was very real. And he used to work for IBM in the show. But then when you asked about it, it was a little bit more of when I reflect on the things that I loved about the show, a lot of it was the characters and the journeys that Maureen, can I call you Mo on this? I'm going to call you Mo. I always call you Mo. So it was like weird to say Maureen just now.
I answer to most things, especially Mo, yes.
The character evolution that you alluded to earlier, but also I think the way they were able to move through time and to really show the tech advances that you also, Melissa, alluded to in terms of, I don't remember the early days. I'm going to say this up front. I was born in 1984, so I don't remember the early days of a lot of the things that the show was talking about from my own memory. But then when they jump to the 90s, maybe that's a spoiler alert, sorry. They jump to the 90s later and they start talking about things like the AOL discs. And like, I was like, oh, now I have a point of reference. When I look back on it, my memory of what I actually experienced and what the show taught me kind of melds a little bit. And that to me was really interesting, just from again, some of this is fictional, but it was capturing a moment in time that was so important to our very real world and our very real evolution of how we do anything.
And for somebody coming in who's around your age, there are a couple of young characters at the start of the show whose timeline better tracks what your experience would have been, which I think is a fun entry point for some of us. Maureen, for you, what drew you to this show? I mean, obviously you were covering it for work,
yeah, no,
but beyond that,
I'm older than I think both of you. So for me, there was a number of things that drew me in pretty quickly, actually. Like, honestly, people are like, oh, the first season I think the first season is good. Like, you know what I mean? It was a very good, solid, interesting, juicy first season. And then it just got better. So that's like huge, that's just staying good would have been great, but it really got great, like literally. But I think there's a few things that really I felt immediate affection for. And one of them was nostalgia for those early days. I mean, the thing is, I was on the original, AOL folders, they were called, in like 1992. Like I really was around for kind of like the birth of certain aspects of the internet or the web or what. I mean, I remember getting, going from a 600 baud modem to a 2400 baud modem and getting those endless AOL discs in the mail. And I think that there's a huge amount of nostalgia for that. Certainly, I would guess among people of my generation, of like, what a brave new world it really was. We're going to fix everything now. I think that's one thing that's so beautifully threaded throughout the show, is how idealistic and excited people are about tech. And now I feel we're on the flip side of that. And I'm not saying tech totally evil 100% of the time. And I can't say that because we're using tech to talk to each other from thousands of miles away. So obviously it still has wonderful applications, and there are visionaries and poets and rebels every still, but like I really actually think a lot of the rebels spirit, a lot of the indie spirit, or a lot of the spirits that are animating, a lot of the cool ambitions that are animating these characters, it's not that they don't exist, but the incentive structure for them is more or less gone. I just, there was so much about Cameron for sure that I identified with. And I really think this is a show that doesn't denigrate ambition as such. And to have a 1 hour American drama that doesn't denigrate women's ambitions and gives women a lot of different kinds of ambitions, and then doesn't subtly fold in, but she's a bad mother. Also, she's a bad person. She's probably gonna die because she's a bad mother, a bad person, and is too ambitious. You know what I mean? So I I wish it wasn't rare, but part of the reason I love Halt and Catch Fire is because it had ambitious, intelligent women that it did not tear down for being those things. And again, being older, I grew up with the following paradigm. Like there's the famous character on LA Law who's like, ambitious and doesn't suffer fools gladly. And spoiler alert, she just falls down an elevator shaft. Like if a woman was really good at her job and into her job and into winning and into being, just exploring new territories and doing cool stuff, and had ambitions, whether that was about making money or being successful, however they defined it, so often films and TV that I grew up with, there was this subtext of, but no one wants her. She's a reject. No one will date her. She's a loser, in some other arena, and Halt did this wonderful job of making all of its characters deeply flawed to the point where you're like, I want to shake this person. This is not good. Don't do this. I mean, Gordon had, like, they all have self-destructive traits or flaws or pride or insecurity or any number of things. But I think I especially appreciate how a show made by two male creators, that at first looked to be another like white bros going through it drama, it really didn't stay that. It really evolved. And the women made mistakes and felt regret and did cool stuff too. But they weren't like torn down because they were somehow threatening because they were ambitious. Do you know what I mean? Like, so I think the show just gave me a window into that idealism of the early tech era, or like personal computers interacting with each other from afar. This is so cool. This is so great. And now we are like, oh, social media is killing our souls. But anyway, um, we're a lot more cynical about it for good reason. So it really captured that ambitious rebel dreamer cutting edge spirit, and it also just had really good relationships. My one of my go-to rants as a TV writer, pop culture writer, is what sets television apart from other mediums is that it's about relationships, characters' relationships with their own goals, characters' relationships with each other over time. And that's what this show did incredibly well. I mean, the Joe of season 1 is not the Joe of season 4. I'm not giving anything away, but that's how it should be. These people, they are as frustrated as with each other as you get with real life people you care about, right? Or they're wowed by each other or impressed by each other. They kind of can't quit each other, and you can see why.
Hmm.
For Cameron and Donna, they they see what the other one's going for. Even if they fully can't see it, they support each other's dreams. Even as they have the same fights, but they found in the show new ways to kind of like show how those difficult dynamics played out. And again, like over time, Bosworth would have been good old boy, There was a wonderful panel just with Toby Huss just talking at ATX TV Festival. I guess I'm doing like light promo duties for you, Danielle, for ATX TV.
I mean, they're only one of my clients, so I mean, like, it's not for me, it's for
saying,
them, but that's great.
There's no money changed hands, but for this glowing endorsement. But Toby, you know, like Toby gave that character, Toby Huss gave that character such soul, such depth. He, you know, his relationship with various characters over time was so fascinating. So 40 episodes also, I guess, kind of points us toward the era that we're in now. I wonder if Halt had premiered in 2006, if it would have been 80 episodes. And maybe it wouldn't have been as good. I don't know, but
let's talk about this a little. I want to get into this further, and just for the sake of wrapping up what you were just saying, Mo. I think we've touched on every main character at least a little bit, and just to put like labels on them to begin to give people who are new to the show a little bit of an understanding. If we consider this like a group that has a bunch of complementary skill sets, we're going to say Joe is your visionary, Gordon's your engineer, Cameron's she's a woman, she's a programming genius, very talented coder. Donna is a hardware expert, but also often is forced to or does affiliate with being a mom. And then we've got Boz, played by Toby Huss, you were just talking about, and he's like sort of the salesman, and that's where they start, and that's just a way to begin them. And then, like you said, like if you look by the end of the show, you've seen really interesting relationship development for almost every pairing in that group. But to the point you were just making, Mo, I'm really interested in this idea of like the actual cultural factors when the show was out. And let's consider this from two different standpoints. So the show is telling stories from the 80s and 90s, but it came out 2014 to 2017 on AMC. And then it was distributed internationally by E1 Television. And then it was released again on Netflix from 2015 to 2021. So now we're stretching sort of into the pandemic with that. So we've mentioned a little bit about some of the factors with some of the other TV shows at the time, like Breaking Bad, but is there anything else that jumps out to you as being important to know about when this show came out and what the landscape looked like? And I'll leave that for either of you to address.
I would just want to jump in really quickly and say it's not based on existing IP. Honestly, getting anything made, that's to me one of the central problems of TV now are shows aren't getting the runs they deserve. If they deserve more than 10 or 20 or 30 episodes, they're not getting it for the most part, unless they have enormous talent or enormous budgets attached. And, you know, I would compare it to a show like The Shield, which came out a decade earlier. Sean Ryan was nobody in the industry then. He was a staff writer on various shows, but he walked in and sold the show to FX, and they bought it, and it ran for 7 seasons. The creators of this show did not have, they weren't a big deal in the TV industry. They weren't like, massively known player makes a new show. They were unknowns within the industry who sold an original idea, and it got, 40 episodes is a pretty cool amount of episodes to be able to make. And now I just feel like that's for someone who's an unknown to pitch non-IP related and to be able to creatively control that piece of television and have 40 episodes. I wish I could say that that's possible now. I don't know how possible it is. It's rarer, put it that way.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I mean, the only thing I would add is what I found interesting at the time was this show and Silicon Valley came out in the same year, and Silicon Valley was very much like Tech Now for 2014. And it was also obviously a comedy. So, different genre, so different tone, but and this maybe says more about me than it does about either of the shows. I was not into that one. That one, for all the things that we're talking about how like the Halt and Catch Fire, maybe on first glance, you didn't know it was going to do so many things for female characters, but then it did. Silicon Valley did not. And so I used to look at the two shows, and Silicon Valley went on long enough that I came back to journalism and had to cover the end of it. And one thing that I found really interesting was a lot of the stuff in Halt and Catch Fire that is kind of the visionary spirit, that is the rebellion. That's what I was hoping Silicon Valley would also be, because now we're so many years later, and like, let's look at where we are and how that early rebellion paved the way for the new one. And I didn't really feel that it ever was, even though they started out those characters, not to get into that show, but those characters in the beginning started out very small, and then some of them became very big in that world, and it just didn't have the same spirit to me. So you know, you can look at how do you define success of one show versus another, but I was just fascinated that they were both able to live at the same time, and concurrently. I mean, because, you know, you said it earlier, Halt and Catch Fire ended in 2017. Silicon Valley ended just a little bit later. So they pretty much were on at the same time all the time. And I was constantly watching both, trying to like draw comparison lines and like see who's making what point about tech and whatever. And it just, I thought maybe those shows would usher in a wave of more of that kind of critical thinking around tech and how we use it in the industry. I don't think it necessarily did. I think obviously at that time, other shows that were new were on different wavelengths. And so, you know, when you look at like, well, what was a success and what wasn't, like, sure, those were successes, but so was Fargo. And that launched in 2014. And that's a totally different genre and a totally different vibe. True Detective, you know, totally different tone. Maybe a little bit more traditional in the crime world. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I could then compare it to what was happening when it was added to Netflix, because when it was added to Netflix, it was, or when it got popular, let's say on Netflix, it's such a different world of just so many players and so many shows and people. If you're discovering Halt and Catch Fire on Netflix in 2020, 2021, like, you can discover anything that's old in that time frame and love it. And it's like the way we talk about it is completely different, because does anyone even know where it originally came from? Maybe not. They just know they love it now and they found it now, and maybe they're mad they didn't find it earlier or not. But to try to look at it as to what else is going on in that time frame makes my head spin, because it makes me feel like everything is going on, because you can access literally everything on the internet. Why you're choosing to find this one and continue to watch this one, I'm glad you are, but I don't know. I don't know what it was that made you do it at this time.
Yeah, such a good point. You know, there's, as we get into some of the smaller details of this show, one thing that so many fans of this show love is the music of Halt and Catch Fire. Both the composed music and the needle drops, the songs we already know that we come in and we hear them and we recognize them. And, you know, being set mostly in the 80s and 90s, we're going to get a lot of songs from around that time period. For you, what are some of your favorite songs played in this show? And if it's in later seasons, we'll try to mention it without spoilers.
I mean, I'll be honest, I'm not the person to ask about music. I will say Melissa was very nice and kind of like prepared me for this question, but I still, so just to go back to what I was saying earlier about, like, I was born in 1984. So like, I didn't really start to care about music until I was maybe 6. So that's already like 1990. So that's already the end of the show. So I won't get into spoilers, but the songs that I cared about were the ones that I recognized as like, oh, I also listened to that, either immediately when it had come out in the time frame that they are using it, or a little bit later, but still in my youth. So like my like best example is A Tribe Called Quest, because I believe they used the song twice, and I was like, great, something I know, and they like it enough to use it more than once. Obviously that's again later in the series. And then one thing that I will say that I enjoyed as someone who, my parents didn't even really play a lot of music in the house, so like I feel like I learned a lot about some of the smaller bands and performers that they would put on the show. Like I think everybody knows Psycho Killer, so when that came on, cool, I recognized it even if it wasn't something I really loved. And I remember they used that, I feel like, a couple times too. But like, I don't know that I knew about PJ Harvey, which might sound crazy. Thank you. You can laugh. But I don't know that I did know really, like, who are you? What are you? But I remember I can't remember the name of the song, but I remember they used PJ Harvey at a really important moment. And I thought, like, this is so perfect for this moment. And what is this song? And I looked it up and was like,
Yeah.
oh, maybe I should have known about you, but I didn't, because
That one was Rid of Me, for those who are
thank you.
PJ Harvey fans.
Yeah,
It's
that
like
when Gordon's
most of
burning
the
his
song
notebook.
plays. Yeah.
Yeah. And like most people probably know who that, have had much more of an education. I was just listening to such specific stuff in my childhood that it escaped me. So I say that to say, like, don't maybe come to me for music questions if you want a smart answer, but also I really liked those moments.
Okay. Excellent. Mo, how about you?
Well, again, I'm old. I'm sorry if I don't mean to music shame ever. I mean, I was a
No,
music
no,
in the
everybody
90s,
music
so
shames me, and it's valid because I
no,
just like I grew up on like 90s hip hop and Mariah Carey, and that was it.
this is
So
a good basis for being a human being. I have no questions about that. No notes. Yeah, I know. I mean, I was in bands and I was a music critic before I was a TV critic, so I was like a bit, music is a big thing for me, but this show used it well, and I think um right off the bat it does it very well with that theme music. That's very specifically placing of like that, that very 80s synth sound very specifically gives you a vibe. There's obviously the music itself has, it's something, it conveys something about technology. They're using technology that this tech, it's not like, a folky strumming away on an acoustic guitar. That would be a different vibe. They very much got you into the show immediately with those opening graphics and the soundtrack, or the music that was composed in that opening music over the credits. But yeah, a show that uses the Pixies is always going to have my heart. And there was just so many really classic 80s songs. They were not above using a huge band like Dire Straits. But I gotta say that especially with the Cameron, like there was a lot of like cool, like in your face, like punk music with Cameron, and I loved that. But uh I will not say where and when you hear it, but there's wonderful use of Peter Gabriel's music, specifically Salisbury Hill. And in terms of using needle drops to underline an emotional moment, I don't know that you could do better than how this show typically used those big songs. And that's another thing I really love. You're not going to get that in Lord of the Rings. You know what I mean? I don't know. And that's a different show, which fair enough. I'm not asking Lord of the Rings to use the Pixies, but I mean, although let's
I mean, if Bridgerton can take modern music,
exactly. Yeah, but that's something that was very much in the aughts and into the and beyond. I found out about a lot of bands from cool TV shows, so I'm certainly not saying that I knew. I may have known who the War on Drugs was when the show was on, but I don't think I learned about them till like kind of during, after the first season. So maybe they turned me on to the War on Drugs, the band, not the actual situation. So yeah, I think they had a fantastic use of music, and honestly, with a show that I'm just going to go out on a limb and say their budget wasn't huge, but they found a way to get a lot of great music. So kudos to that team.
Hmm. I think something that this show does really well is it makes you think about your experiences with the tech that they're coming up with, the tech that they're discussing. As I watched this show, it reminded me of the first computer I used and sort of what that situation. Like I remember using my dad's Apple IIe, and he had one of those printers that just printed line by line. And if you had a lot to print, just let it go overnight because
Right.
it's not going to be done anytime soon. So it made me want to ask you, like, what was the first computer you both remember using? And sort of what was that environment like for you?
you want to go first?
Yes, once again, it'll be like this will be the Mo is an old person show, but I was in college. I graduated college in 88. So Washington University, and there was a computer lab that you went to. If people had computers in their rooms, 84, 85 to 88, I didn't know those people. I don't know that how there were personal computers, but I think most people didn't or a lot of people didn't have them. But I definitely remember the excitement around computers, like those cool Apple computers when there was the clear one that showed you the back and all this stuff. I mean, Apple, it's hard to oversell like how cool it was to be the tech rebel. And when you had the cool, like bright blue, Apple personal computer on your desk, like you were the coolest, and I remember floppy disks and having to save everything on those little things. So yeah, it was, I would say, really in college, that's when it started to be on my radar, but I didn't have a computer in my room. I didn't have a computer like really in my living situation probably until I was into my 20s. In college, I went to the computer lab, and I do remember specifically, like if you wanted to print out a paper, you would like set it to print and then like go to the dining hall and come back an hour and a half later. Everything took forever. But I also really, really strongly remember in 92, 93, the sense of incredible excitement there was over, I'm talking to someone who lives in Australia about this, I don't know, something going on in the world, on a message board chat. Like just the other day, Television Without Pity celebrated its 25th anniversary. That started out as Mighty Big TV. This was late 90s, but when a lot of people were like, finally in the late 90s, people were like, had a personal computer, had something in their home, whatever. Message boards, right? Like there was a time when message boards weren't necessarily overrun with people being, completely behaving unacceptably. It was the Wild West, and some people were jerks, but there was just such a magic to thinking that you could connect to people who cared about the pop culture thing that you cared about, and geography didn't matter. You could just talk to them. And this is how old I am. My parents, when I finally did get a computer in my apartment, they were like, now this email thing, do you have to be waiting? Like they thought it was like a postman, like you had to have your computer on and sit there and wait and accept it. And I'm like, you just log on and check it whenever you want. And they're like, this is wizardry. They never really understood it. That ushered in the great era of everybody's parents asking them if they could fix the home printer, which you can't. You can never. It's just home printers. Why? They're terrible.
Oh my gosh.
That was a little bit of a segue, but yeah.
No, we got a home computer when I was in, I don't know, 4th grade maybe, and that was my whole life for the rest until I moved out at 18. Was like I had to write my parents instructions on how to turn the computer on, to the point where I like just put a Post-it note by the button.
Oh yeah.
And was like, this one. I mean, because in the beginning it was more complicated. The very first computer was, multiple buttons and whatever. But then at a certain point we graduated and now it's one button, just figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember
the printouts of how to, Dad, here's how to log into your AOL account. I cannot tell you how many times that, Dad, this is the last one I made for you. Why did you never look at it? I don't understand, but yeah.
I mean, we didn't even do that, honestly. Like I had the AOL account, my parents did not. I don't remember what the very first computer we had in the house was. I remember the big like boxy Macs that we had, because I did have in school, we had like education games that we were allowed to or forced to. I thought they were fun. But I don't know. I mean, there was Oregon Trail, obviously, but then there was one that was like Number Munchers. It was like supposed to teach you math, but I thought it was fun. I don't know. We had that starting maybe 92-ish, I feel like, in school. But then what I hated was like they went through all the trouble. I went to public school, so they didn't have a lot of money, but they did go through the trouble of having at least a few of those computers, not in every classroom, but in certain ones, so that we could learn. But then when I got to 6th grade and they taught us typing, we had to learn on typewriters. And I was like, what are we doing? Technology is not cyclical. And I think it was because they wanted to force us to understand mistakes. Like you could delete too easily on computers, but on typewriters, like just type and we can see how you did. And okay, I see value in that to a degree, but it just felt ridiculous at the time. I don't know. I will say I did a summer program in high school, and I had a laptop but didn't bring it but I was taking college classes. It was at UCLA. We took 2 classes, we got credit. When we had to write papers, we had to go to a computer lab. So it's not an age thing. That was like in existence. I think they're still in existence for kids who can't afford computers. So like it's a rite of passage, I think. The computers obviously have changed, but the experience I think is pretty much the same.
Oh my goodness. One of the fun things that happens in this show is, Cameron as a character is really into games. And so we see a lot of different games that are played in this show, partly because of her character and partly because it's what was there at the time. But we're going to see games like Adventure, Super Mario Brothers, Duck Hunt, Mario Kart, quite a few different games are played. And, you know, which games do you remember from when you were, if there was a time when you were ever playing games, which ones were really jumped out at you? And were any of the ones in this show ones that tapped into your nostalgia?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't a very big video game person on my own, but my friends were. So like if I went to my friends' houses, all of those that you just mentioned, we were playing. I think on my own, the only ones I really played, like I would play Donkey Kong, I would play Mario Kart. I had one of those, what were they called? The old Sega handhelds. I did have a Game Boy, I just didn't like it as much. And there was like a Sonic game that I liked, which I don't think ever made it into the show. Maybe it was a licensing deal. I don't know. Um, I was so stupid. I was more into like the computer games I mentioned earlier, like the Oregon Trails of the world, the Minesweepers that we graduated to, or like when we got our first cell phones and we played Snake. Like that was my frame of reference.
Right? Oh my gosh. I remember, this is how old I am, going to this one local restaurant, and the main draw was they had really good ice cream sundaes, and also they had Pong. I mean, obviously, like that's not what this show is about, but I
No,
remember
but that's
being like,
cool.
it's just, like you move the thing and then it does, like that seemed magical to me, you know. But yeah, I remember this is probably like I'm sure the if I went back and reviewed the content of this game, I would be like on some level horrified. But when one of my first jobs out of college, so like this is late 80s, I played with a coworker. We played Zelda like on her after hours. You know, it'd be like, okay, let's like play games. So we played some Zelda, some other like, you know, sort of like quest games like that. But one of them was Leisure Suit Larry, which I've gone back and like looked at the Wikipedia for that, and I'm like, um, not ideal on a number of levels, but like that's what there was. There was like the one game there was not like a million games, you know, maybe there were, and I just didn't know the cool enough people who knew about them. But yeah, Leisure Suit Larry, and it was always like you have to go to this room now and go get this and pick up that and open that door. And so I thought that was really fun, and I always played it with a friend, you know, it was like a cool thing. And then in the early 90s, right around this time this show was wrapping up, amongst my various job was I went to go work at Electronic Gaming Monthly, or the company that owned EGM, Electronic Gaming Monthly. At that point in the early 90s, I need you to understand that magazine was selling 500,000 copies a month. It was the nerd gamer Bible,
Wow.
and I was the fourth woman hired by that company. So stories. I have a lot of stories about that. I mean, in terms of like tech, nerd, I mean, the level of nerdistry going on there, it was absolutely mind-boggling. And I get together with friends who we all worked there at the time, and it was like truly an epic level of gamer nerd culture in like 92, 93, 94 when we worked there especially. And so yeah, I'll never forget that I told someone who was a huge gamer in like 93, 94, where, you know, oh yeah, I work for this magazine company. I worked for their new branch. We did like the licensed magazines for certain shows. I was the founding editor of the original X-Files magazines, the official X-Files magazine. I know, huge celebrity. It's fun. But like a lot of shows, we did their licensed mag, and then we also had our own pop culture magazines. And I was like the editor of 3 of them at one point, just normal stuff, earning no money. And I told someone, oh, I want
That is cyclical. That's where we are in journalism.
we're still there. It's still happening. I told someone I knew all the guys from EGM, and they're like, "Do you know Cowboy?" I'm like, "Yes, I know Cowboy. He typically buys all of the cookies in the vending machine before I am able to get to them, so that's not great." But like, they were the rock stars of, in like gaming, like those dudes that I worked with, and yeah, it was a very strange time, but also kind of like nerd. It was the start of nerds kind of being cool, the like, it just, I don't know, Comic-Con rose in importance during that decade.
Yeah.
There was a lot of nerd culture that I feel like I saw it in its infancy, but then it kind of went. So I would never call myself a huge gamer, but right now, because of the kind of things we saw in Halt and Catch Fire, because of that kind of tech and thinking, my son is now like a gaming influencer and streamer. So like that, like he earns money from that. So like that's a thing I did not envision when I was, playing very rudimentary 8-bit games like
Right.
a long time ago.
I mean,
Oh, that's
honestly,
so
those are the
true.
kinds of things I wish this show had continued on to see. How would they handle it? How would the characters handle it? Like, what are the
Right.
thoughts? Like, who would be responsible for building what in that universe? Because yeah, you mentioned earlier, like just the chat rooms and being able to connect with people across the world who love the same things. And like, that's really more where I was at. I mean, the games were cool when we could do them on the computer, but I was much more about, I want to get in a chat room and I want to talk to people because I hate the teenagers in my own town and I don't want to be their friends. So like, who can I meet that has more of an alignment with what I'm interested in?
And just going back to your point, Danielle, about Silicon Valley, I mean, whatever you think about that show, it was at least meeting Silicon Valley where like there's
where it
so
was, yeah.
pop culture, especially that I grew up with. Gaming is bad, gamers are bad, tech is like, there's so much reflexive, like, well, the technology is bad for the children. I mean, when I was growing up, Tom Hanks starred in a movie about how Dungeons and Dragons was like ruining the youth
Yeah.
of America. So like there's always these panics about like tech, games, gamers, like, and this is a show where it was complex in terms of how it depicted those worlds. And I'm totally with Danielle that like it could have kept, leapfrogging every few years into like these different waves of what's happening now in tech and entrepreneurship within that world, in gaming and message boards. And I mean, Cameron she was basically understanding that the connection was what people wanted. And that's the famous saying of the show that Joe said, that's the thing that gets us to the thing. The thing that we want is to meet people, or to find something that we feel an emotional connection to. And I feel like the tech lords of now don't, if they understand that, they would just prioritizing making money for themselves over that.
One of the things I think the show does very well is that as much as it's exploring this technology that, like we've said, is going to like let you sort of reach out all over the world, this show is also, I think a lot of times when it's at its best, it's very small and intimate. And we even do see that that tech facilitates their relationship sometimes in very quiet ways, or like you might see a couple people who are doing a private chat and that's like furthering their relationship, or a really long phone call and that's furthering their relationship. But then we've also got the situation where you're starting to expand the world of the show by bringing in people who we can't even see because they're on the other side of their computers. So I think it's this wonderful balance that the show strikes. I want to look at we've mentioned that there are a couple of kids in the show. When the first season, they're young. I want to say they're like in the like 4 to 6 range in terms of their age. It's Joni and Haley Clark, who are the daughters of Donna and Gordon. And because this show is going to go into the 90s, we're going to see them advance into their teen years. But along the way, we're going to see him playing with things like My Little Ponies and Cabbage Patch Kids. And then as they get older, we're going to see their fashion and the music they're listening to. And it just allows for a very different generational look at what the interests were at that time. So as I mentioned, these characters, what jumps out to you in terms of maybe some of the cultural elements they were able to bring in because they had these two younger characters there?
You know, now that you've said that, I think the thing I immediately came to mind is not even them. But I mean, I obviously I remember that like their rooms changed a lot. Like the posters they had on their walls were suddenly, you know, groups and bands from that time. Bands I didn't know, because as we've established, I don't know music. But this is gonna sound crazy because I'm such a TV person. The thing that's always stood out to me about like the references was a Fresh Prince discussion, but I don't think it actually was Haley or Joni that had that discussion. So maybe I'm answering your question completely wrong.
No, but that is brought up around that time.
Yeah.
That's a season 4 conversation. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now I have to think about it because now what's specific to the kids? The things that I remember are the posters more than anything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's been a little while since I've done a rewatch. Ever since ATX, I've wanted to do a rewatch. I was going to do it before the reunion panel, and I didn't, so that's on me. But it's always in the back of my mind is wanting to do a Halt rewatch. But I think I think what I really would want to say about their relationship, or the children rather, is um, they didn't demonize Donna for being an ambitious woman who was also a mother, and they didn't sugarcoat it. They didn't make it like, well, she's a super mom and she's cooking a great meal every night and her kids are happy. And I mean, the thing is, I felt very seen by that part of the show, because at that time I was working, I think Danielle and I were working together at various times. I
Oh
was
yeah, at the
working,
end of the show. Yeah, I would think I was
yeah,
the
yeah,
end.
we
Oh.
were. So I was working really hard, taking care of my parents. I have a son, and so, I'd go away to the TCA press tour, and like I'd always feel like I'm leaving something undone. Maybe I'm letting people down. But a, if there's one complaint I've had since day one of someone writing about popular culture, it's that American television and film, when it depicts being a parent, it's usually bad at it. When it depicts a woman as a mother, it's usually really, really bad at it. Like, I'm torn up by guilt because I'm a bad mom. Am I a bad? Like, it's usually very superficial and not interesting to me. It's especially they were younger when the show began. Like, that's a very crucial scene when Gordon is like, I don't want to do this stuff, and she's fixing the speak and spell, but there's two little kids wandering around. So I love that the show, within a tightly constructed dramatic format, embraced the ambiguity of being a parent with ambition, being a woman with ambition, and not apologizing for the ambition. Donna founds multiple companies. She does have to be the adult in the room. She does have to be the one to tell Cameron or different people at different time, no, you can't do that because you don't have the budget for it. This is the reality, right? And actually, now that I think about it, to me, it showed how her skills as a parent really transferred to the corporate realm.
Hmm.
This was stuff she was already doing. How do I budget my time? How do I get this done efficiently? How do I take care of all these multiple people, and not just the company's needs, but everybody's psychological needs, which, because she's a woman, she shouldn't have to do that. But I felt like it showed how that could be kind of a secret weapon for her. But it didn't ever sugarcoat motherhood. Like, there's this tendency in American TV for sure of like doing the most superficial, I'm a bad mom, I feel bad plot line, or I'm a super mom, I'm great at everything and I always look great and I look put together and my hair is awesome. Like, those are no one exists at either of those poles, but this show acknowledged that really, I think, very smartly and empathically.
It absolutely did. As we sort of close out here, I wanted to ask if there's any other details of the show in terms of like cultural elements of it that really jump out at you that you wanted to make sure to mention here. And it can be from any area of it, perhaps something that I haven't explored, but I'm sort of filibustering to let you think about your answers.
I mean, I don't know if this is what you mean when you say cultural, but I mean, just to piggyback off of what Mo was talking about with Donna, like in the beginning of the series, I always really loved and identified most with Cameron because I felt like the rebellion in her was a lot like my own rebellion. It came out in different ways, but I don't know. I just felt like there was something there. But as the series went on, one of the things that really struck me, and it might have been where I was at, like professionally in my life, was Diane and Donna's relationship. Because as Mo's talking about Donna running companies and taking things that she did organically as a mother and being able to apply that to being a good boss and good at her job, Diane's mentorship always stuck out to me because she was someone who had come before Donna, very much a man's world, still was, but like more so even because it was years before. And I always felt like the women that rose then, and maybe to some degree still today, had to harden a lot of who they were to succeed. And they had to maybe change a little bit about how they did business to succeed. And what I really responded to was Diane, she wasn't kicking the door behind her. She was still kind of tough love though. And I like the tough love. I will say that I don't want anyone to cry and I don't want anyone to be belittled, but I do think we can't coddle people in the professional world. I think there does need to be a little bit of like, I'm reaching my hand out to help you, but I'm also giving you the tools to help yourself and those who come behind you. And that was something that I really responded well to because I don't know how much I had seen it depicted this way in other shows, or maybe I had seen it and just not responded as well to it because it wasn't done as well. I don't have that answer. But I also just liked how it also, who Diane was. I felt like it showed a nice layer to her to see her relationship with Donna versus like Boz, which was a relationship that we don't necessarily need to talk about. I did not fully understand. I was like, I don't know, you're so different, but also like he does bad things that you should have seen coming and you're like blinded by your love for him, whatever. That's a different conversation. So that's something that, I mean, I think about it a lot in terms of like, is that cultural of the time, but also maybe it's not because maybe it is still happening today. Like the mentors you have today, if they came up that way, they may still be very tough love, but at least hopefully they're holding the door open for you. And if you don't like how tough love they were, you can change that towards your next, whoever you are shepherding in.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. The mentorship on display a lot. I mean, I don't know. I really love shows that show people having conflict.
Mm.
That's the source of drama, obviously. Like I'm not like some genius, but these people fought and they were really angry at times. They really, really, it was deep hurts because they did care about each other so deeply that the betrayals or what was perceived as stabbing in the back that hurt, but they would find a way to come back to each other. And I think that that's so interesting and it's so true to life. But I do think that, again, it's not been like, oh gosh, there are too many shows with women seen as mentoring each other, you know, just trying to help each other. You know what I mean? It's not like
Yeah.
every drama was doing that, but this show did that. And I think so. I think I want to riff a little bit on what Danielle said. Like, I gotta say, there was a time after, like, you know, Battlestar Galactica is one of my favorite shows of all time, but it went off the air, and I'm like, literally, I missed those people. Those are relationships. But I miss the fact that it had a bunch of different women who were not all alike, not all cookie cutter, and were friends with each other and would have conflict or relationships that evolved in good ways or bad. Like female friendship is just not something that TV for most of my life was all that interested in delving into in a deep way. It's not that it wasn't there, but like what's the deepest and richest and even thorniest way to depict that? So the show did female mentorship, female friendship really well. It showed women in tech. Women have always been in tech. Ada Lovelace, like going back to the earliest roots of computing, I think when the histories get written, so often the people who are at the margins get written out of it. So we know about the big titans of the 80s and 90s and 70s and whatever, but like there were always women in every one of those companies and every one of those worlds and every one of those chat rooms or tech endeavors doing cool stuff. You know, there were always people of color there that like, but we just don't get that story. So I love the fact that it did that. And then the last thing that I'll mention that I felt was important, and again, you know, even in 2000, a show that ran during that time frame, 2014, 2017, Joe is canonically bisexual.
Mm.
And I, you know, again, like that, it's not that gay characters or queer characters were not on TV, but a prestigious, you know, high production value 1 hour American drama, to have a lead character be a bisexual man, bisexual person, it just wasn't that. It was uncommon. I mean, maybe it's one of those situations where the show was kind of a cult show. I wanted, just referencing something, Danielle, there's so many shows, whether it's this show got put on Netflix, there's so much happening that if a show like Halt in that first season did not get a large Nielsen rating, which is a thing people used to care about, believe it, look it up. It just kind of was it was itself on the margins, but I still think that was cool that they did that and didn't shy away from that being an aspect of who he was without necessarily defining him. So I really appreciated that.
Mm. Such a good point. And I mean, so many great things that you mentioned there. And I appreciate that you both mentioned Diane as well. She's my favorite character, I think, in all of TV. She's probably the closest thing I can think of to most of the women that I know. And yet, why haven't I seen her before, you know, like
Right?
on screen? So I love that you brought that character up. But this has been such a cool conversation to delve into some of the things that we haven't been able to talk about as much in these interviews. And, you know, I know that you both have a lot on the go. What are you, of the things that you can talk about, is there anything that you want to plug, anything that you're up to now that you want to share?
You go.
You have better stuff.
Maureen's calculating the
I
minefield
know,
of
she
things
has
she
too
can and
much.
can't talk about, maybe.
No,
That's fair.
Well, I mean, honestly, if you're in the Chicago area, or even if you want to fly in later in October, I'm going to be hosting a Battlestar Galactica 20th year reunion here in Chicago. Go to the Creation Entertainment site. I am like, is this real life? This is one of those, is this real life surreal moments where I'm like, this is happening in my hometown. This is the best thing. So yeah, so come on down to that. I will be at New York's Comic-Con a little bit later this month with a Winona Earp panel. And yeah, that's the main stuff I have going on.
You have a book, Mo.
I have a book.
Assuming this drops a while from now, is there something
Okay.
that you see coming out in a little while?
Yeah, well, I am going to be, there's something called Joko Cruise. Jonathan Colton has this like cool nerd driven cruise. I'll be on that in March. And if people want to sample my book, I'm always making appearances around or vlogging my book. And Danielle's been nice enough to talk to me about it. But I wrote a book about the entertainment industry and what it could do better, called Burn It Down, Power, Complicity, and a Call for Change in Hollywood. So that's around all of the time. Find it at your local bookseller or ebook purveyor.
Fantastic. Danielle, how about you?
Yeah, right now, I am not really working in the journalism field. I'm kind of freelancing in places that no one wants to hear about. So the one thing I will say is I have a podcast that you were nice enough to mention at the top of this. It's called Made Possible by Pop Culture, the podcast. It's obviously wherever you get your podcasts. And then there is a video version on YouTube, like what you're doing here. And we're in season 2. And so the guests right now are kind of a range of writers, actors, musicians, authors, like, you know, whoever wants to come on and talk about influences from their childhood. Not unlike, I guess, the nostalgia conversation we were having here. So, you know, honestly, if anyone is listening and is a Halt and Catch Fire fan and wants to come on and talk about it, feel free. But yeah, that's the main focus right now. And then trying to make my dog famous. If you want to follow him on Instagram, it's at the real Mr. Archie. And he did not make an appearance in this video, and I'm sad. I don't know. He must be asleep in the other room.
I was promised a dog
I thought he would,
sighting.
honestly. He usually wanders in the background of my podcast, so I don't know what happened today. He might just be asleep.
Didn't want to be associated with nostalgia, I guess. Okay, well, that's fine. Thank you so much, both of you, for taking time and having this chat, taking a trip down our memory lane and talking about Halt and Catch Fire.
Thank
Yeah.
you so much for having me. It was a blast.
Ditto.
And to everybody who's watching this, I hope this made you want to see or rewatch the show. And please go out there and watch Halt and Catch Fire. Bye, everybody.
Bye.